War often begins with certainty. In April 1982, as Argentine forces occupied the Falkland Islands, the opening calculations of air power appeared brutally simple. Argentina possessed more aircraft, more types of aircraft, and airfields far closer to the battlefield. Britain, by contrast, was attempting to project power across 8,000 miles of ocean with a force that looked dangerously thin. Too many observers. The outcome in the air seemed already decided. Yet within that confidence lay assumptions that would soon be tested in ways no planning document could predict. Argentina's air arm was large, diverse, and intimidating on paper. Over 100 combat aircraft were available for operations connected to the Falklands. Mirage 3 interceptors promised high-speed air superiority. II Daggers and A4 Skyhawks were proven strike aircraft capable of carrying heavy bomb loads at low altitude. Long-range Cambras added another layer of threat, while the arrival of Super Attenders armed with Exocet missiles introduced a weapon that could change the balance at sea in a single strike. The numbers suggested dominance. The reality would prove far more complicated. At the center of Argentina, air operations on the islands, stood Port Stanley. Though its runway was too short for fast jets like Mirages or Daggers, it remained a vital logistical hub. Transport aircraft, light attack planes, and helicopters flowed through the airfield, supporting the occupation and reinforcing Argentine control. Smaller strips at Goose Green and Pebble Island extended this network, allowing aircraft to disperse and complicate British targeting. From the Argentine perspective, the islands were secured not just by troops on the ground, but by an umbrella of air power that could be reinforced daily from the mainland. Facing this was a British task force, sailing south into isolation. Britain's entire fixed-wing air defense rested on just 20 Sea Harriers, split between 2 aircraft carriers. These aircraft were expected to do everything at once: protect the fleet from attack, intercept Argentine fighters, and provide support for any eventual landings. They were operating at the extreme edge of British logistics, dependent on vulnerable carriers that could not afford to be lost. One serious blow could end the campaign outright, and everyone involved understood it. The contrast between perception and reality was already forming beneath the surface. Argentina's aircraft were numerous, but many would be forced to operate from mainland bases hundreds of miles away. Flight times were long, fuel margins tight, and time over target brutally short. British Sea Harriers were few, but they would fight close to their carriers, under constant coordination and with pilots trained intensively for air combat at sea. None of this erased the imbalance, but it quietly shaped what air supremacy would actually mean once fighting began. If you're finding this unfolding story gripping so far, please take a moment to click the subscribe button and like the video. It helps more people discover this channel and allows us to keep bringing you deeply researched, story-driven history like this. At the outbreak of the conflict, however, such nuances mattered little to public perception. Argentina appeared to control the skies by sheer weight of aircraft alone. British ships steamed south, knowing they would soon face an opponent who could strike them repeatedly, day after day. There was no friendly land base nearby, no safe fallback position. Every assumption rested on the belief that numbers would prevail, and that belief carried a quiet confidence that bordered on inevitability. Yet even before the first major air engagement, cracks began to appear. Argentine planners understood that Port Stanley's runway limited fast jet operations, but they believed mainland aircraft could compensate. What they could not easily overcome was distance. Every sortie demanded precise timing, flawless navigation, and perfect coordination. Any disruption, any unexpected resistance, would compress already narrow margins. British planners, watching from afar, saw those margins as potential pressure points rather than insurmountable walls. The Sea Harrier itself symbolized this tension between expectation and reality. On paper, it was slower than the Mirage 3, less glamorous, and vastly outnumbered. Critics questioned whether it could survive against modern interceptors, but the aircraft was designed for close-in combat, capable of operating from short decks and reacting quickly to incoming threats. British pilots trained to exploit these strengths, refusing to fight on terms that favored their opponent. The coming battles would not resemble neat diagrams in briefing rooms, but chaotic encounters shaped by terrain, fuel, and split-second decisions. As the task force approached the islands, both sides believed time favored them. Argentina hoped to strike decisively, before Britain could establish a foothold. Britain hoped to endure long enough to disrupt Argentine plans and force mistakes. In the air, this tension hardened into a waiting game, where each side prepared to test assumptions forged far from the south. Atlantic's cold, unforgiving skies. By the end of April, the stage was set. Argentina stood confident in its numerical superiority, convinced that British air defenses could be overwhelmed. Britain stood exposed, reliant on a small cadre of pilots and machines to hold back an entire air force. Supremacy existed on paper, but paper would soon give way to steel, fuel, and fire. And when the first British response finally came, it would arrive not from nearby carriers or island airstrips, but from a place so distant that it would force both sides to rethink what reach, vulnerability, and air power truly meant. Distance had always been Argentina's quiet ally. The Falklands lay close to the South American mainland, while Britain's nearest major base sat thousands of miles away in the Mediterranean. Geographers seemed to favor the occupiers, reinforcing the belief that British air power would arrive late, tired, and constrained. But British planners were already preparing a response that would challenge not just Argentina's air strategy, but its entire sense of security. Before any troops could land, Britain needed to send a message. Port Stanley's airfield was the symbolic and practical heart of Argentine control. As long as it functioned freely, Argentina could claim that the islands were firmly within its defensive perimeter. Destroying it outright was unlikely, but demonstrating that it could be reached at all would force Argentina to reconsider how safe its position truly was. The solution was audacious to the point of recklessness. From Ascension Island, a remote volcanic outcrop, halfway between Britain and the Falklands, the Royal Air Force prepared an operation without precedent. The Vulcan bomber, a relic of Britain's Cold War nuclear force, was never designed for such a mission. Its navigation systems were outdated, its refueling capability improvised, and its endurance dependent on a delicate chain of tanker aircraft. If any link in that chain failed, the bomber would be lost far from friendly territory. On the night of April 30th, 1982, 2 Vulcans and 11 Victor tankers lifted off into the darkness. Almost immediately, the plan began to unravel. One Vulcan suffered a technical failure and was forced to turn back. The mission should have been aborted. Instead, the reserve aircraft, XM-607, piloted by Martin Withers, pressed on alone. Ahead lay 8 hours of flight, multiple mid-air refuelings, and a target defended by radar and anti-aircraft guns. The complexity of the operation was staggering. Tankers refueled tankers so that other tankers could refuel the Vulcan. Each transfer had to be timed perfectly. Any error in fuel calculation would cascade into disaster. Crews were flying at the limits of endurance, knowing that failure meant ditching in the South Atlantic. Yet one by one, the refueling contacts succeeded, and XM-607 continued south, invisible and unstoppable. As dawn approached on May 1st, the Vulcan descended toward Port Stanley. From 10,000 feet, Withers released 21 1,000-pound bombs. One struck the runway, tearing a crater into its surface. Others damaged nearby installations. From a purely tactical perspective, the damage was limited. The airfield was not destroyed, but the psychological impact was immediate and profound. For the first time, Argentina had been struck directly by British air power. The islands were no longer beyond reach. The assumption that distance alone guaranteed safety collapsed in a single night. Sea Harriers followed swiftly, attacking Port Stanley and Goose Green. These raids reinforced the message delivered by the Vulcan. Britain was not waiting passively offshore. It was probing, testing, and willing to take enormous risks to alter the balance of the conflict. The attacks forced Argentine commanders to confront an uncomfortable truth. If Britain could strike the Falklands from Ascension Island, then the Argentine mainland itself might not be immune. The response was swift. More Argentine fast jets were held back for homeland defense, reducing the number available for operations over the islands. Resources that might have overwhelmed British defenses were now divided. Air supremacy, once assumed, began to fracture under the weight of uncertainty. The war in the air was no longer about numbers alone, but about where those numbers could safely be used. At sea, the implications were just as serious. The British task force, still vulnerable and far from land, had demonstrated both intent and reach. This emboldened British commanders while unsettling their opponents. The Falklands campaign was becoming a contest of nerve. where perception could matter as much as physical destruction. Yet the British achievement came with its own risks. The Vulcan raid could not be repeated indefinitely. Aircraft, crews, and tankers were stretched thin. Every success raised expectations that might not always be met. Argentina, meanwhile, was adapting rapidly, searching for ways to exploit British weaknesses rather than confront their strengths directly. The skies above the South Atlantic were changing. The opening belief in Argentine dominance had been challenged, but not overturned. Both sides now understood that the coming battles would be shaped by surprise, endurance, and the ability to absorb shock without collapsing. The longest reach had been demonstrated. What remained was to see how Argentina would respond when its confidence was shaken not by defeat, but by doubt. Shock does not always arrive with warning. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the space between confidence and complacency. And when it does, entire strategies collapse overnight. The Vulcan raid on Port Stanley had already forced Argentina to reconsider its assumptions. The belief that distance guaranteed safety was gone. But the true rupture came not from the sky, but from the depths of the South Atlantic. On May 2nd, 1982, the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano was torpedoed by the British submarine HMS Conqueror. Within hours, the Argentine Navy withdrew its surface fleet to port. Among the ships that turned back was Argentina's aircraft carrier, 25 de Mayo. It would not sortie again for the rest of the war. With that single event, Argentina lost the ability to project naval air power around the islands. The fleet's retreat reshaped the conflict, leaving the air war almost entirely in the hands of land-based aircraft. The strategic shock was immense. What had seemed a layered, flexible defense now narrowed into a single, fragile lifeline stretching from mainland airfields to the Falklands. Every flight would be longer, riskier, and more constrained. In the air, the first direct fighter engagements exposed deeper problems. Argentine Mirage, 3 pilots sought combat at high altitude, where speed and climb performance favored their aircraft. British Sea Harrier pilots refused those terms. They stayed low, forcing engagements into close-range dogfights, where training, coordination, and missiles mattered more than raw performance. When combat finally occurred, the results were stark. 2 Mirages and a Canberra were lost, while the Sea Harriers returned unscathed. These early encounters carried consequences beyond the immediate losses. Fuel limitations meant Argentine pilots often had only minutes to fight before turning back. Long transit times drained concentration and compressed decision-making into brief, violent moments. Training disparities began to show, particularly in coordinated air combat. The expectation of dominance gave way to caution, and caution quickly hardened into restraint. On-the-ground maintenance crews struggled to keep aircraft operational. Spare parts were limited. Aircraft cannibalization became routine. Every loss reduced not just numbers, but confidence. The psychological balance in the air war began to tilt, not decisively, but perceptibly. Argentina still possessed striking power, but it was no longer free to use it as planned. If you're appreciating the depth of this story and how these turning points connect, please remember to click the subscribe button and like the video. It truly helps this channel reach more people who value serious, story-driven history. Faced with these realities, Argentina adapted. Direct air superiority battles were abandoned. Mirages were reassigned as high-altitude decoys, drawing Sea Harriers away from the fleet. The real blows would come at low level. F-4 Skyhawks and daggers would skim the sea, using speed and surprise to punch through British defenses. It was a dangerous tactic, but it offered the best chance of success. The effectiveness of this shift was proven brutally on May 4th. 2 Super Attendants flying low and fast launched Exocet missiles at the British destroyer HMS Sheffield. One missile struck the ship, igniting fires that could not be controlled. Sheffield later sank, becoming the first Royal Navy destroyer lost in combat since the Second World War. The psychological impact on Britain was immediate and severe. The message was unmistakable. British carriers were the center of gravity. Lose one, and the entire campaign would collapse. From that moment, every decision was filtered through a single imperative: protect the carriers at all costs. This meant keeping them far to the east of the islands, beyond the reach of most Argentine aircraft. It was a rational choice, but one that carried its own hidden price. Distance reduced risk to the carriers, but it also reduced the time. Sea Harriers could remain over the battlefield. Fuel margins shrank. Patrol windows narrowed. The burden on pilots intensified. Air power, once again, was being reshaped, not by design, but by necessity. By mid-May, the air war had become a grim exchange of adaptation and endurance. Argentina had accepted losses to remain dangerous. Britain had accepted vulnerability to remain present. Neither side could disengage. Both understood that the next phase would be decided not by grand gestures, but by sustained pressure under fire. And as British forces prepared to land troops on the islands, the skies above a narrow inlet called San Carlos would become the most unforgiving arena of all. Every war has a moment when theory ends and survival begins. For the Falklands campaign, that moment arrived on May 21st, 1982, as British forces moved to land at San Carlos water. The choice of location reflected hard lessons already learned. San Carlos was surrounded by hills that limited radar coverage and offered some protection from high-altitude attack. British commanders hoped the terrain would blunt Argentine air power long enough to get troops ashore. What followed would prove that geography could only soften, not stop. The violence to come. The decision to keep the aircraft carriers far to the east now shaped everything. Sea Harriers had less time over the landing zone, fewer opportunities to intercept attackers, and little margin for error. When Argentine aircraft appeared, they often arrived suddenly, skimming the sea at such low altitude that radar warnings came too late. Ships became their own last line of defense. From the Argentine perspective, San Carlos represented both opportunity and desperation. Pilots launched from mainland bases, knowing they would face intense anti-aircraft fire, Sea Harrier patrols, and exhausting flight times. Many had trained for conventional strike missions, not the brutal precision demanded by low-level maritime attack. Yet they flew anyway, driven by the understanding that this was their best chance to break the invasion before it could succeed. Wave after wave followed. Four Skyhawks, Daggers, Mirases, and even turboprop Pucaras plunged into the narrow waters of the bay. British sailors watched aircraft flash past so close that wingtips seemed to brush the waves. Some jets tore antennas from ship masts as they passed. Bombs fell among landing craft and warships alike, sometimes failing to detonate, sometimes striking with devastating effect. Losses mounted on both sides. British ships were hit, damaged, and in some cases, lost. Fires raged on decks as crews fought to save their vessels under constant threat of renewed attack. Argentine pilots flew into walls of tracer fire, missiles, and cannon shells. Many did not return. Others landed with empty fuel tanks, having spent mere seconds over the target area before turning for home. At first, British observers viewed the attacks as reckless, even futile. But as the days passed, that judgment changed. The courage required to fly such missions became impossible to ignore. Argentine air power, constrained by distance, fuel, and training, remained lethal. Every successful strike reminded Britain that the balance in the air was still fragile. The Sea Harriers worked relentlessly. Pilots flew multiple sorties a day, often landing back on carriers low on fuel and exhausted. Their presence saved ships and lives, but they could not be everywhere at once. The limits imposed by carrier distance and fuel endurance meant gaps would always exist. Argentine pilots learned to exploit those gaps, timing their attacks to slip through moments of vulnerability. Yet endurance began to favor Britain. Despite losses, the landings held. Supplies flowed ashore, troops dug in. Each day that passed reduced Argentina's chances of reversing the invasion. Air power, once expected to decide the conflict quickly, was now locked into a war of attrition it could not easily win. By the final phase of the campaign, Argentina's aircraft were worn down. Spare parts were scarce. Experienced pilots were gone. Missions continued, but at ever greater cost. British forces, battered but intact, tightened their grip on the islands. Control of the air had never been absolute, but it was sufficient. The Falklands Air War ended not with a single decisive battle, but with exhaustion. Argentina's numerical advantage had been eroded by distance, shock, adaptation, and relentless pressure. Britain's smaller force had survived by refusing to fight on unfavorable terms, and by absorbing punishment without breaking. In the end, the skies above the Falklands told a hard truth about modern warfare. Victory did not belong to the side with more aircraft, but to the side that adapted faster, endured longer, and accepted the full cost of its choices. The war was decided on land, but it was shaped in the air.